I never thought my life would unravel the way it did. Looking back now, I can see how blind I was, how much I trusted her without question. Her name is Claire, and for 10 years, she was my world. We met in college, two awkward souls finding comfort in each other's company. She had this laugh, a light, melodic sound that could fill a room with warmth, and eyes so kind they made you believe everything would be okay. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but it was ours. We lived in a small house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees that turned gold every autumn. It was quiet there, peaceful. I worked as an accountant at a firm downtown, while Claire stayed home during the early years, painting watercolors and tending to our garden. Eventually, though, she grew restless. She said she wanted to do something meaningful. That's when she joined the charity organization. At first, I encouraged her. How could I not? She lit up talking about the people she'd met, the families they were helping, the fundraisers she helped organize. I saw the spark return to her eyes, the same one I remembered from when we were younger. But somewhere along the way, things changed. Or maybe they didn't, and I just failed to notice. It started subtly, a missed dinner here, a late-night phone call there. She always had excuses. Meetings ran long, someone needed help setting up supplies, paperwork piled up. I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, why wouldn't I trust her? She was Claire, the woman who promised me forever under a canopy of stars. But then came the distance. Not physical, no, not yet, but emotional. Conversations became shorter, less frequent. She seemed distracted, like her mind was elsewhere even when we sat together on the couch. At night, she'd turn away from me, claiming exhaustion. And those nights stretched into weeks, then months. One evening, I found myself staring at her across the table. Candlelight flickered between us, casting shadows over her face. She smiled softly, but it didn't reach her eyes. Something inside me shifted, a tiny crack forming in the foundation of what I thought was unshakable. For the first time, doubt crept in. What was happening to us? Little did I know, the answer lay hidden behind closed doors, waiting to shatter everything I held dear. Claire threw herself into the charity work with a fervor I hadn't seen in years. At first, it was inspiring, watching her come alive again, hearing her talk about the families they were helping and the events she was planning. She spoke of one volunteer in particular, someone named Daniel, who had quickly become her confidant. "Daniel's amazing," she said one evening as we sat in the kitchen. Her voice carried a brightness that felt foreign now. "He understands things, like he just gets it, you know? He's been through so much himself." I nodded absently, sipping my coffee. "That's good," I replied, though my tone betrayed none of the unease growing inside me. Who was this man? Why did his name seem to linger on her lips longer than necessary? She went on to tell me how Daniel had lost his wife to illness a few years ago and dedicated himself to volunteering ever since. "He says it helps him heal," she added softly, almost wistfully. "It gives him purpose." Purpose. The word echoed in my mind long after our conversation ended. What about us? Didn't we have purpose together anymore? These questions gnawed at me, but I buried them deep, convincing myself I was overreacting. Weeks passed, and Claire grew busier still. Late nights became the norm, and weekends disappeared into charity commitments. She'd leave early in the morning, humming softly to herself, and return home with flushed cheeks and stories of their latest projects. Each story seemed to feature Daniel prominently, as if he were the linchpin holding everything together. One Saturday afternoon, curiosity got the better of me. I told myself I wanted to surprise her, to see firsthand what had captured her attention so completely. So, I drove to the community center where the charity operated. As I approached the building, I saw her through the window, standing beside a man I assumed was Daniel. He was tall, with broad shoulders and dark hair streaked with gray. There was something commanding yet gentle about him, a quiet confidence that drew people in. They stood close, heads bent together as they discussed something intently. His hand rested lightly on her arm, a gesture that might have seemed innocent to anyone else, but to me, it felt weighted, deliberate. My chest tightened, and I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. What was I doing here? Spying on my own wife? Shaking my head, I started the car and drove away before either of them noticed me. But the image stayed burned into my mind. The way she smiled at him, the ease with which they interacted. It was different from how she acted around me these days, guarded, distant. That night, when Claire came home, I tried to act normal. I asked about her day, listened to her recount another success story involving Daniel. But every word felt like a knife twisting deeper. Sleep eluded me that night, and I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene from earlier in my mind. Was I imagining things? Was jealousy clouding my judgment? Or was there truly something between them? Something neither of them dared to admit aloud? The uncertainty ate at me, gnawing away at the edges of my sanity. And as the days stretched on, I realized I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something had shifted between us, and whether it involved Daniel or not, I needed answers. It was a Tuesday evening when the cracks in our fragile world finally split wide open. Claire had been out late again, and I sat alone in the living room, staring at the clock as its hands ticked past midnight. Each second felt heavier than the last, pressing down on my chest until it became hard to breathe. When she finally walked through the door, her cheeks were flushed, her hair slightly disheveled from the wind, or perhaps something else. She froze when she saw me sitting there, waiting. "You're still up?" she asked, her voice tinged with surprise and guilt. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I stood slowly, feeling the weight of everything unsaid settle over me like a suffocating blanket. "Where were you?" I asked, my tone calm but laced with an undercurrent of tension. "Just at the center," she replied quickly, avoiding my gaze as she slipped off her coat. "We had some last-minute planning for the fundraiser." Something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the way her eyes darted away, or the faint tremor in her voice. Whatever it was, I couldn't hold back anymore. "With Daniel?" I pressed, my words sharp enough to cut through the air between us. Her reaction told me everything I needed to know. She flinched visibly, her hands clutching the edge of the counter behind her. "Why are you asking about him?" she said, her tone defensive now. "What's this really about?" I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my ears. "Because every time you come home, he's all you talk about. Because you spend more time with him than you do with me." My voice rose despite my efforts to stay composed. "And because tonight, when I drove by the center, you weren't there. You were somewhere else with him." Claire's face went pale, her lips parting as if to deny it, but no words came. Instead, tears welled up in her eyes, spilling silently down her cheeks. That silence spoke louder than any confession ever could. It confirmed what I'd feared most. She had betrayed me. "I trusted you," I whispered, my voice breaking under the weight of betrayal. "I gave you everything, my love, my loyalty, and this is how you repay me?" She shook her head frantically, reaching out toward me, but I stepped back, recoiling as though her touch might burn. "It's not what you think," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "We're just friends. It's complicated." "No," I interrupted coldly, cutting her off before she could say more. "Don't insult me by lying now. I saw the way he looked at you, the way you look at him." My fists clenched at my sides, nails digging into my palms. "How long has it been going on?" She hesitated, and that moment of hesitation shattered whatever remained of my composure. "Tell me," I demanded, my voice echoing harshly in the quiet room. Finally, she broke down, sinking onto the couch as sobs racked her body. "A few months," she admitted, barely audible. "But it wasn't supposed to happen. It just did." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving me breathless. Months. While I'd been oblivious, carrying on with life as usual, she had been building a secret life with someone else. Betrayal burned through me, hot and consuming, mingling with a deep, aching sorrow. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating, broken only by her muffled cries. All the love, trust, and memories we'd shared seemed to crumble around me, reduced to ash by her admission. And then, anger began to rise within me. Not the fiery rage of earlier, but something colder, darker. A calculating fury that whispered promises of retribution. She had taken something precious from me, something irreplaceable. And now, I would make sure she understood exactly what that felt like. As I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her sobbing on the couch, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and hollow mornings. I moved through the house like a ghost, my mind consumed by thoughts of Claire and Daniel. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of fabric seemed to echo their betrayal in my ears. My anger didn't fade. It simmered just beneath the surface, waiting for an outlet. I avoided her as much as possible, retreating into my work during the day and wandering aimlessly at night. When we did cross paths, the tension between us was palpable, thick enough to choke on. She tried to talk to me several times, apologizing, explaining, but I shut her down each time with icy silence or curt dismissals. There was nothing left to say. Instead, I began a plan, not out of passion or blind rage, but with cold, methodical precision. Revenge wasn't about losing control. It was about taking it back. And so, I started gathering information, pieces of their lives that would become tools in my hands. It began innocently enough. I joined the charity's mailing list under a fake name, attending meetings where they wouldn't expect to see me. From the shadows, I watched them interact. The subtle glances, the lingering touches, the way they laughed together like old friends who shared secrets no one else could understand. Each moment fueled my resolve. One evening, after another long day of pretending everything was fine, I found myself sitting at my desk with a notebook open before me. Pages filled with observations, dates, patterns, all meticulously documented. It was then that I realized how little I truly knew about Daniel. Who was he, beyond the man who had stolen my wife's affection? What vulnerabilities lay hidden beneath his polished exterior? A name caught my eye as I scrolled through social media profiles late one night. Daniel Harper. He had a LinkedIn page, complete with glowing recommendations and photos of him shaking hands at charity events. But buried deeper in his online presence were glimpses of a more private life. A daughter in college, estranged from him since her mother's death. A modest home tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. Even a hobbyist photography blog showcasing sunsets and abandoned buildings. These fragments painted a picture of a man trying to rebuild himself after tragedy, but also someone deeply flawed, carrying wounds he hadn't fully healed. That knowledge gave me an idea, one that sent a shiver down my spine even as it crystallized in my mind. If Daniel thought he could waltz into my life and take what was mine, he was wrong. If Claire believed she could erase years of love and commitment with a few whispered apologies, she was mistaken too. They had underestimated me, and soon they would regret it. The next morning, I woke with purpose. I dressed carefully, choosing clothes that made me look unassuming yet professional. Then, I drove to Daniel's neighborhood, parking a block away from his house. As I walked past his driveway, I noticed something telling. A stack of unpaid bills peeking out of his mailbox. Financial strain. Another weakness to exploit. By the time I returned home, my notebook was brimming with new details. Each piece of information felt like a weapon, sharpened and ready to use. Yet, as satisfying as these discoveries were, they weren't enough. Not yet. To truly break them, I needed something bigger, something unexpected. And then it came to me. A plan so simple, so devastating, that it almost frightened me. Almost. That night, as Claire slept fitfully in our bed, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me, I sat alone in the dark, mapping out every step. By the time the sun rose, I knew exactly what I had to do. Revenge isn't just about hurting others. It's about making them feel the same emptiness you've been forced to endure. And I intended to make sure neither Claire nor Daniel ever forgot what they'd done. The plan began to take shape in ways that felt almost surreal. It was as though I were watching myself from a distance, detached yet utterly focused. Every action I took was deliberate, calculated to destabilize their fragile connection without revealing my hand too soon. The key was subtlety, planting seeds of doubt that would grow into something unmanageable. My first move came on a Thursday afternoon, during one of the charity's weekly meetings. I arrived early, slipping into the back of the room while volunteers bustled about setting up chairs and arranging supplies. Claire and Daniel were already there, standing near the podium, deep in conversation. Their body language spoke volumes. They leaned toward each other slightly, their voices low and intimate. To anyone else, it might have looked like two colleagues collaborating, but to me, it was a betrayal written in plain sight. I waited until the meeting began, then casually approached the refreshment table where Daniel had left his phone charging. No one noticed me as I picked up the device, pretending to glance at the snacks nearby. With practiced ease, I unlocked it using the passcode I'd gleaned from observing him type it weeks earlier. Once inside, I navigated to his email app and sent myself a copy of his recent messages. Just as quickly, I returned the phone to its spot and stepped away, my heart pounding but my expression calm. Later that evening, I sifted through the emails in the privacy of my home office. Most were mundane, work-related correspondence, reminders from the charity, but buried among them was gold. An exchange between Daniel and a woman named Rachel. Her tone was flirtatious, playful even, and his responses hinted at a history between them. Though the messages stopped abruptly months ago, they painted a picture of a man who wasn't as devoted to Claire as she might believe. This discovery gave me an idea, one designed to fracture whatever trust existed between them. Using a burner email account, I crafted a message to Claire, posing as Rachel. The words flowed easily, dripping with insinuation. "Hey Claire, I hope you don't mind me reaching out, but I thought you should know. Daniel and I go way back, and we've stayed close even after everything. I just wanted to check in because he mentioned some things lately that made me think maybe you deserve to know more about who you're working with. Let me know if you want to talk." I hit send before I could second-guess myself, then deleted the draft to erase any trace. Within minutes, I received a notification that the email had been opened. My stomach churned as I imagined Claire reading those lines, her mind racing with questions. Would she confront Daniel? Or would she dismiss it as nonsense? The next day provided my answer. When I came home from work, I found Claire pacing the living room, her face pale and drawn. She looked up when I entered, her eyes flashing with anger and confusion. "Did you know Daniel has an ex-girlfriend?" she demanded, her voice sharp. I feigned surprise, raising an eyebrow. "An ex-girlfriend? What are you talking about?" "She emailed me," Claire said, holding up her phone. "Said they've been in touch recently, that they're still close." Her voice cracked on the last word, betraying the turmoil beneath her composed exterior. "I'm sure it's nothing," I replied coolly, masking my satisfaction behind a mask of concern. "People stay friends after breakups all the time. Maybe she's just trying to stir up trouble." Claire hesitated, uncertainty flickering across her face. "Maybe," she murmured, though she didn't sound convinced. That night, I overheard her arguing with Daniel on the phone. Her voice was hushed but laced with accusation, and his responses grew increasingly defensive. By the time she hung up, slamming the receiver down, I knew the seed of doubt had taken root. But this was only the beginning. The real blow would come later, when I struck closer to home, not just at Daniel, but at Claire herself. Because revenge isn't complete unless it forces someone to confront the full weight of their choices. As I lay in bed that night, listening to her restless movements in the other room, I allowed myself a small, bitter smile. They thought they could rewrite our story, erasing years of love and loyalty with their fleeting infatuation. But stories like ours aren't so easily rewritten, and I intended to make sure they remembered that. The days that followed were a masterclass in manipulation. I watched as the fissure between Claire and Daniel widened, their once effortless camaraderie now strained by suspicion and mistrust. Each interaction they had seemed to carry an undercurrent of unease, like two people tiptoeing around a landmine they couldn't see but instinctively knew was there. Claire became quieter, more withdrawn. She spent hours on her phone, scrolling through old messages and emails, searching for evidence to either confirm or deny what Rachel had told her. Her frustration mounted when she found nothing concrete, no smoking gun to prove Daniel's guilt, but the doubt lingered, gnawing at her like a persistent ache. Meanwhile, I continued my campaign of subtle sabotage. It wasn't enough to plant seeds of discord. I needed to ensure they bore bitter fruit. One evening, while Claire was out running errands, I slipped into her laptop and created another burner email account. This time, I posed as Daniel himself, sending a cryptic message to Claire. I need to talk to you about something important. Meet me at the park tomorrow after work. Please come alone. The next day, I positioned myself near the park, hidden behind a row of trees, to observe. Sure enough, Claire arrived right on time, her face tense with anticipation. She waited for nearly half an hour, pacing back and forth, before finally leaving in obvious disappointment. When she returned home later that night, I could tell she was seething, not just with anger, but with hurt. He stood me up, she muttered bitterly, throwing her bag onto the couch. What kind of game is he playing? I shrugged, pretending indifference. Maybe he got caught up somewhere. Or maybe, I trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Or maybe he doesn't care anymore, she finished for me, her voice trembling. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away fiercely. Why does this keep happening to me? Her question hung heavy between us, unanswered. I wanted to laugh, at her naivety, at how oblivious she was to the web I was weaving around her, but I kept my expression neutral. Sympathy, not mockery, was what she needed to see from me now. As the weeks passed, the tension between Claire and Daniel reached a breaking point. Their conversations grew shorter, colder, until they barely spoke at all. At charity events, they avoided each other entirely, retreating into separate corners of the room like magnets, repelling one another. The change was palpable, even to the other volunteers, who began exchanging curious glances whenever the two were mentioned in the same sentence. But I wasn't satisfied yet. For all the damage I'd inflicted, it still felt incomplete, as though I'd only scratched the surface of what they truly deserved. Revenge isn't just about causing pain. It's about dismantling the foundation of someone's life, leaving them with nothing to hold on to. One evening, I decided to escalate things further. Using the same burner email account I'd used to impersonate Daniel, I sent another message, this time addressed to the entire charity board. The subject line read, "Concerns about Daniel Harper." Inside, I outlined fabricated allegations of financial misconduct, claiming Daniel had been siphoning funds from the organization for personal use. To lend credibility to the accusation, I included screenshots of falsified bank statements I'd painstakingly created using online templates. The final touch? A note suggesting that his relationship with Claire might be influencing his decisions within the charity. Within hours, chaos erupted. Rumors spread like wildfire among the volunteers, fueled by whispers and speculation. Daniel was called into an emergency meeting with the board, where he vehemently denied the accusations, but the damage was already done. Trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to repair. When Claire heard about the allegations, she confronted me directly. "Do you think Daniel did it?" she asked, her voice tinged with desperation. "Could he really have stolen money from the charity?" "I don't know," I replied, feigning uncertainty. "But if it's true, wouldn't that explain a lot? His behavior lately, the way he's been acting so secretive." She didn't respond, but the doubt in her eyes was unmistakable. That night, I overheard her crying softly in the bathroom, her sobs muffled by the sound of running water. It was a cruel thing to listen to, the woman I had loved unraveling before my very eyes, but I reminded myself that she had brought this upon herself. Daniel resigned from the charity shortly after the allegations surfaced. Whether it was to protect his reputation or because he simply couldn't bear the scrutiny anymore, I'll never know. What mattered was that he was gone, banished from the world Claire and I shared, reduced to little more than a shadow lingering at the edges of our lives. But losing Daniel didn't bring Claire peace. If anything, it made her spiral further into despair. Without him to blame for her unhappiness, she turned inward, questioning everything about herself, her choices, her worth, her ability to trust anyone ever again. Our marriage, already fractured beyond repair, became a hollow shell of its former self. We lived together in silence, two strangers sharing the same space but existing in parallel universes. Meals were eaten separately, conversations were stilted and forced, and nights stretched endlessly as we lay awake in opposite ends of the house. Despite the emptiness, I refused to let go of my anger. Every glance Claire gave me, every sigh she exhaled, felt like a reminder of what I had lost and what she had taken from me. I began to withdraw completely, immersing myself in work and hobbies that kept me occupied but offered no real solace. Then, one rainy afternoon, something unexpected happened. As I sorted through old files in my office, I stumbled upon a folder containing photos of Claire and me from happier times. There we were, smiling brightly at the camera, arms wrapped around each other as though nothing in the world could tear us apart. Seeing those images hit me like a punch to the gut, forcing me to confront emotions I had buried deep inside. For the first time since discovering her betrayal, I allowed myself to feel, not just anger, but grief. Grief for the life we had built together, for the love that had been destroyed, for the person I had become in its aftermath. Tears streamed down my face as I sat amidst the ruins of our past, clutching the photographs like lifelines. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. Revenge hadn't healed me. It had only left me emptier than before. In the days that followed, I found myself questioning everything I had done. Was this who I wanted to be, a man consumed by bitterness and vengeance? Had I gained anything meaningful from destroying Claire and Daniel's lives? Or had I merely perpetuated a cycle of pain? The answer came to me in fragments, pieced together during sleepless nights and quiet moments of reflection. Revenge hadn't brought me closure. It had only widened the chasm between who I was and who I wanted to be. And as much as I hated to admit it, Claire wasn't the villain in this story. She was as broken and lost as I was. One evening, I approached her in the living room, where she sat staring blankly at the TV. "We need to talk," I said softly, sitting beside her. She looked at me warily, unsure of what to expect. "I've done terrible things," I confessed, my voice trembling. "Things I can't take back. But I want you to know, I'm sorry. For everything." To my surprise, she didn't lash out or storm away. Instead, she nodded slowly, tears welling up in her own eyes. "So am I," she whispered. "I never meant to hurt you. I got lost." We talked for hours that night, laying bare the wounds we had inflicted on each other. It wasn't easy. There were moments of anger, of defensiveness, but for the first time in months, it felt like we were truly communicating. By the end of the conversation, we both agreed on one thing. Our marriage was over. Too much had been broken to piece it back together. But perhaps, in time, we could find a way to forgive, not just each other, but ourselves. Months later, I stood outside the small house we had once shared, watching as movers loaded boxes into a truck. Claire was starting fresh in a new city, pursuing a career in art therapy, a path she had always dreamed of but never dared to follow. As she hugged me goodbye, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. "You'll be okay," I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. "So will you," she replied, giving me a small, hopeful smile. After she left, I returned to the empty house, taking stock of the life I had ahead of me. It wouldn't be easy, letting go of the past never is, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that I could rebuild, not just my life, but the person I had become. Revenge may have been my initial path, but forgiveness, however difficult, was the road to healing. And as I closed the door behind me, ready to face whatever came next, I knew I was finally moving forward.